and we decided, I think it was number 6 on the one about parole and giving people on parole the right to vote. So, yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the pros. Also, I'm Aubrey. This is a new thing.
Yeah.
So the first thing we talked about was that there would be a higher voter turnout, and I know that the focus right now is a lot on youth voters, but if we were to allow anyone who's on parole, not only would we be getting youth voters, we would be getting an intersection of a whole bunch of different voters, especially people in poorer communities, people of color, which these rules that don't allow people on parole to vote directly affect.
So we also talked about just higher voter turnout. There's currently over 4.5 million people in the U.S. that are on parole and that can't vote. And so when you increase the when you make sure that people on parole can vote, that's like 4.5 million people can now vote. And as was talked about before, the people on parole are by the vast majority poor, people of color. And you see this cycle of poverty and this cycle of disenfranchisement that continues on like from Jim Crow era because of this policy. And so when you take it away, you make sure that like we stop discriminating against like a specific group, and that we allow for like a wider range of people to be able to vote.
And the last part I wanted to talk about, just really quick, is that it's one of the most easy to implement because you're not going out of your way to make new jobs and introduce new laws. It's literally just like one shift in a statewide law. Anyway, okay, going on to the comments.
So some of the problems with it is whether or not, my name is Vivian, sorry, is whether or not we can trust the judgment of people on parole. Although a lot of people who do get on parole, it's usually for white collar crimes, right? There are, and domestic, misdemeanors. There are people who do get very short sentences, up to 1 year, for things like sexual abuse. And it's really, and they can get parole. And it's really hard to decide whether or not we want them voting in our country when they've done something so awful. So it becomes also like an idea of like questioning who we think has the moral values to vote in our society. And then technically they're not fully integrated back into our society. So like there's a question of like, should we be allowing them to vote at all?
So the rebuttal to some of those cons is that
What's your name?
Oh, I'm Sarah, sorry. So the rebuttal to some of those is that there are a lot of domestic abusers and sex offenders that don't get charged at all and are already voting. And so the fact that they would be voting is overpowered by all the good that this will do. Also, okay. Also, Aubrey made a good point when she talked about how the parole doesn't directly cause youth voters, but it will do this. And also, kids who have parents that are on parole, being able to see their parents that are voting will encourage them to vote as well.
And just quickly, one more thing. Very quick, we talked about having civic education for these parolees somehow implemented, maybe when they go to see their parole officers, because we know since they're in jail, maybe, we also talked about how they're not fully integrated into society, so maybe giving them some sort of civic education or general education, so it's like more valuable and they're more reliable in voting.
Questions. You guys can call on who you like.
Cool. My name is Mati. How reasonable is it to assume that people, like the demographic you guys are talking about, people in poor communities, how reasonable is it to assume that they'll actually register to vote and turn out to vote at these polling places?
Well, we know that these are people who are especially in lower income communities, they want to vote, but since there are already since it's already so difficult for them to vote, we can't say it's an 100% guarantee, but we can say that allowing them to vote while on parole does open that door. And if we're opening that door, why would people not vote, you know?
And just continuing on that, actually, so in Florida, there's been a petition signed by tens and tens of thousands of people on parole and people who were felons who wanted to vote. And so we clearly see that there is a demand for people who are currently disenfranchised and who can't vote and who want to vote. They're asking to vote and we're denying them that right. And this, I guess, policy, this legislation takes that away.
Excellent. Another question?
Orange, your hand up before. You mentioned that.
Can you say your name again?
Oh, I'm Francis, and you mentioned that kids who have parents that are on parole will be encouraged to vote based on seeing their parents vote. However, we see like there are parents who like aren't on parole who do vote, and they may not always encourage their children to vote. I for one can attest that I have gone to like a voting ballot with my mom, and it hasn't actually encouraged me because it gets a bit dull and boring. You see like the process of voting going on. So
I mean, I think we all know that the process of voting is not necessarily the most exciting thing. And I see where you're coming from that, but like the act of just seeing someone vote and being active in our democracy, whether like you think it may encourage them or not, is going to like implement into their mind the idea that like voting is important and that it's something that can happen, and like seeing like your family members and like your mom or dad or like grandparents or whatever voting is going to like show you that like it's important and something possible because it's they're doing, whether it's the most exciting thing or not.
And just to put it simply, children don't listen, they replicate. And if they see their parents that they look up to doing something, you internalize that behavior and repeat it.
Also, it shows them that they have a voice and like they can participate in civic engagement, and shows them that
Especially
that's
while
important.
they're in parole.
Yeah.